Hi, this is David Torriello with XBRL US. You're here for getting started with the XBRL API. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. Again, welcome. This is David Torriello with XBRL US. You're here for getting started with the XBRL API. With me today, I have Mark Ward, who is Applications Manager at XBRL US. Why don't we go ahead and get started? This is a 30-minute webinar. We're just going to step through the process for getting you connected to the API that's attached to the XBRL US database of public filings. Today, we're other items on our agenda that we'll cover just very briefly are standardized financial data, its global availability, talk a little bit about what data sources we have, what data sources are out there in XBRL standardized format, and a little bit about what our plans are going forward with standardized data and adding it to our XBRL US database of public filings. Talk a little bit about, Mark's going to talk a little bit about how and why we collect and share this data. And then we'll do some demonstrations, show you where to go and how to get attached to the XBRL API add-on. Finally, a demonstration of some templates that we've produced and talk a little bit about documentation. In terms of availability, on the screen, you'll see a listing in the top right-hand corner of some of the countries outside of the United States that have XBRL data, either collected by a regulatory agency within that country or collected by an industry group. In the United States, the US Securities and Exchange Commission has been collecting XBRL data since about 2008, 2005, if you want to go all the way back to a volunteer program that preceded the requirement to file publicly. In addition to operating companies, mutual funds and credit rating agencies also publish data in XBRL format and submit it to the SEC. In addition, the FFIEC, that's part of the FDIC, collects call report data on a quarterly basis. And in addition, the Department of Energy has embarked on an orange button program and as a result has built a taxonomy for solar project finance. All told, there are over 60 countries, over 100 regulators, and over 10 million companies that produce and manage XBRL standardized financial data. I'm going to turn it over to Mark now to talk just a little bit about how and why we collect and share data. Mark?
Thanks, David. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Let's see, so many years ago, XBRL US decided to store filing information in a manner that would make analysis easier. We built what we call the XBRL US database. Initially, it was designed to hold all filing information published by the SEC since 2008. But as we obtained more data and started analyzing, we found patterns related to various issues in the filings. So we developed a set of rules that we called the consistency checks or validations and used them to identify issues in the filings and actually store them in the database. In the API, that's actually referred to as assertions. So we've built a load process with the ability, we've also built a load process with the ability to aggregate data from multiple sources. We plan on loading and exposing other sources from Japan, Mexico, and Taiwan. Moving on to the API standard, that's basically a standard for, in this case, is a standard for querying data from our databases and any data that conforms to the XBRL 2.1 specification. By having a standard language for querying the data, it allows application developers or anyone else who wishes to analyze the data to use the same method across multiple data sets, and therefore encourages app development. The data community is a place to share data and to share information about this whole process. And David will talk about that right now.
Great, thanks, Mark. You can see there are just a couple of bullet points relative to the data community. It's a hybrid of member-only resources, member-contributed resources, and public questions about how to use the XBRL API, primarily focused on using the API through the Google Sheet application, although as Mark will touch on here in a couple of minutes, we do provide a file, a resource that attaches to a free application called Insomnia that's often used by application development teams to query against a data set and design queries that can then be moved into applications and tested prior to their being made available to the public or made available to a larger team. So it's really a tool that's more of a proof for some of the higher level queries that can be made against the database. And I probably should make just a slight mention here in that the data that comes out and goes into the Google Sheet is limited in terms of some of its functionality, and you perhaps have seen that or will see that in some of the returns for the query. And by that, I mean, sometimes the data is nested. In the documentation, we describe what nesting is, but if you think about it, it's literally like a hierarchy to the data that's returned. Unfortunately, Google Sheets aren't really built to provide the kind of view into that nested data that you might like. If you take it into Insomnia, you can certainly see that nesting a little more clearly. However, it comes at the price of having to wade through some of the tagging that's done to that data. In other words, you'll return data, but it'll be in a top to bottom format. It won't be comfortable rows and cells. So that's a little aside from the data community, but I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on some of the uses and limitations of the Google Sheet API versus requesting a client ID in secret to develop on your own, taking it into Insomnia, getting yourself set up there, and then ultimately moving the client and the secret and your queries into your own applications. So just to drop into where to go, what to do, how to get yourself set up, you're looking at a homepage of the XBRL US website, or I should say a picture of it. The materials, the resources, all of the things that we've talked about here so far are under the data button on the homepage of our site. You can see XBRL API, data community, members have access to our database of public filings from an application perspective. In other words, you don't need to use the API. You can request access to the database itself and then do your querying from a desktop application. We recommend something like PG Admin, although you're free to use whatever resource can get you connected to the database if you choose to use the database of public filings in that way. Coming to the API page itself, we're showing you on the left-hand side the page. Just a quick aside here. You come to this page, you'll see the default view that shows a little bit of data that we actually did pull from the database of public filings using the API in our website. However, the data by default is dummied in data. If you log in, the table at the bottom of the left-hand side of the screen returns actual data, not filed on September 14th or August 31st, but potentially filed today or within the last 24 hours as companies are submitting their filings to the SEC. As Mark mentioned, what we're doing is listening to the SEC on an RSS feed. When we hear back from the SEC that they have accepted a new filing, we run out to the SEC, copy that filing into our database, wire it up for use in our database, and it becomes available almost within every 15 minutes, Mark. I think that's the standard that we're working on. On the right-hand side, am I right, Mark, at 15 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
It loads approximately every 10 minutes, depending on how busy it is.
Okay. On the right-hand side are the resources that we'll look at a little deeper here in just a second, starting with the documentation. It's a PDF document that really lists out all of the different parameters that you can use in structuring a query to return data values. The middle piece is, of course, the add-on itself. So you can click on that link from the right-hand side of the API page and get to the add-on. Bottom is the initial view of a template that we produced back in September, October, after having worked with a group of beta testers for most of 2018. I think we kicked it off in February or March and finished up with the beta period for the API in late September, early October. On the community side, up in the top right-hand corner of the page, as I mentioned before, we've got several resources. Some are public, some are private for members only. We hold periodic meetings. We have one coming up on the 20th of February where we do a deeper dive. We give developers the chance to strut their stuff and show off what they've developed, what they've contributed or are planning on contributing to XBRL US so that we can make spreadsheets or templates or hopefully at some point applications available to the broader community that rely on the XBRL API to serve up data. Last but not least, the online discussion forum, a great way to find answers to questions that you may have at the beginning or that you may have in an ongoing perspective about how to use the API to return data that you're looking for. I'm going to hand it back to Mark to talk a little bit about some of the tools that we've mentioned here so far. Mark?
Okay. We have a few different ways that you can access information. The first, the traditional way, in the upper right-hand corner, you can see there's a company filing analysis. This is part of an application called the XBRL US Tools for SEC Filers, which is available for our members. It basically allows you to query filings directly from the database and obtain a lot of information like concepts and values reported. The next is the client, the Insomnia client that you see on the left. And this is actually a tool for querying the API directly. It's a REST client, and well, more information about how to configure it is on our website, and we have some templates with some example samples that you can use to get you started with that. The latest and probably the most easiest to use off the bat is on the right, which is the spreadsheet or XBRL spreadsheet that uses the add-on that I will actually demonstrate in a couple minutes. Yeah, actually, I'll go ahead and demonstrate this now. Give me one moment to share this. So before you use the spreadsheet, the first thing you need is an account. You can just go to our website and sign it and create an account there, and that will give you basic access to the API. The link to the spreadsheet, as David had shown earlier, is right here on the page for the XBRL spreadsheet. Once that opens up, you need to make a copy by just saying File, Make a Copy. And you need to do that because due to some limitations, the plugin won't work correctly if you don't own the sheet. Once you own the sheet, you should go into the add-ons and create, of course, now it's not showing up. Here we go. And add XBRL API access. Once you do that, this add-on will show on the drop-down, and you go into the authentication menu and authorize the API. This will take you to the page, and you can either use your username or password, or if you use this, you can log in with Google. Once you close this tab, you can go back here, and now you can go ahead and pull up information. Up here are just some different ways of pulling the information. Down here is where it's actually set up in spreadsheet format. So you can choose a few pre-done queries that we've configured right here by selecting it from the list, and it'll go ahead and pull it down onto here. Let me move there. Let's go to specific fact. As for a couple options, there's a couple ways to display it. The query results will return it as a table. You can also change it to what field tree, which gives you a breakdown of the fields that are returned, including some of the, I believe that what David was referring to as the nested information, or more information that's a little bit difficult to show in a spreadsheet format. To give you sort of an example of what this one looks like, let me go back to the query results. For those, they're actually flattened out into one sheet. If we pulled up this same information in Insomnia, you can see it's broken out so you can see that relatively easily. In the spreadsheet, we actually have a way to drill down into that on a limited scale. You can choose specific field, and this basically returns just the information that you type in on this field right here. So we can type in dimensions, and this shows that information that was flattened before into a nice table. So one of the things that you can also do as you're using this is you can add your own report information in the configuration tab. You can just name it and put in the query that's used to retrieve the information from the database, and David will go over that in a couple minutes. And matter of fact, right now, so we'll move over to the balance sheet comparison. This is an example of how this can be used, and David will talk about this some more.
Great, thanks, Mark. So initially, we had an API that was a little more difficult to use. It required substantial knowledge of XBRL nomenclature. We kind of tried to strip that away, and hopefully you can see that pretty clearly here. So this balance sheet comparison is a holdover from that first API that's been restructured to work with the new XBRL API, new since October. We are leveraging some of the details provided from the SEC's website in the ticker symbol field. The green fields at the top and at the left are configurable as part of the template. meaning that you can change tickers or change the elements to change the data that's presented here. So Mark, if you just change that IBM to HOG, we'll pull up Harley-Davidson's 10K, most recent 10K. That's what's in the query that drives the data that comes across in the blue and white cells. And you can see we have Harley-Davidson's 2017 10K in that third column. Just a word of warning, it's here in the directions. These displays for Microsoft, Google, and Harley-Davidson don't line up with the ticker. They are in reverse chronological order. So if you're working with this template, just be sure you're making note of which companies report in which column after row 3. Scrolling down into the nuts and bolts of the template itself, past the financial information that you saw flash up there, I draw your attention to cell A22, A22 provides some report information. That's basic details for the company that is filing financial information at a certain point in time with the SEC. We've extracted some report details. Down below that, we're pulling out specific factual information from each of those 3 reports. And the way we do that is with cells 34, B, C, and D, the cells that are highlighted in purple. So the orange represents the full query that you could take out, drop down somewhere else, and have literally the same presentation up here. The cells in purple are the DTS, that's Discoverable Taxonomy Set. That's a number that we assign as part of our databasing efforts. It lets us know what report what the report is that was filed. It's kind of like a central key or primary key for that bit of information that really leads to all of the subsequent details for that report. Scrolling down, there are 3 filings in this report, this comparison, and each of the 3 filings returns specific data values. And again, the orange cell at row 38 is the query that returns that information. So, Mark, I'm going to take it back here.
Sure.
And come back to the presentation. Let me just share my screen. So the way the query works, we use endpoints. Sometimes it's a fact endpoint, sometimes it's a report endpoint. Mark mentioned an assertion endpoint. I'll show you a list of endpoints here in just a couple of minutes. And the parameters to filter and the fields to sort in order to return the records. So from A36, that first one that we looked at, or excuse me, the second orange block that we looked at, we have Apple's line items that I want to report back into the upper part of the template, the blue and white cells. It's a fact. It's a set of facts that I want to search that DTS for in that period, fiscal year 2018, with no dimensions. Dimensions are an XBRL structure that allows companies to report similar factual information for specific sectors. Eventually that detail gets aggregated and rolled up. So I don't want to have any of those dimensions. I want to have what's essentially the aggregate of those dimensions. For a fiscal period of a year, Y, right? And then the concept local name, those are all the concepts that were in the green on the left-hand side of the template. As a result, I show the fields of the concept local name sorted in ascending order alphabetically. Then I provide the fact value, the fact decimals, and the period fiscal year. So it's fairly straightforward in terms of the understanding and in terms of the nomenclature that we're using in the API. If I take that out, I can really go anywhere with that. I will share my copy of the XBRL API sheet. If I go to any sheet where I have the add-on enabled, and I just apply the function that we use with that really lengthy query, I get the same tabular format, the same data is returned. And that's it. That's understanding a little bit about a sample query. Let me come back to presentation here. If I can find it, there we go. That query is what gets returned in those cells. The first of the three pieces that we said we were going to talk about today, remember there was the documentation, the add-on itself, and then the template. We'll go all the way back to that top and talk a little bit about the documentation. The endpoints that are available to you, to anybody, regardless of whether or not you're a member, are listed on the left-hand side of the page. So we have facts. We looked at report endpoint as well, a little bit about entity, concepts, the DTS, believe it or not, there are some details relative to each one of those DTSs that is submitted to the SEC that we've databased, networks and relationships, a little bit of higher level stuff going on there. That may be where you start looking to another resource to pull out data because it tends to be structured in more of a hierarchy. And it lends itself less well to working with inside of Google Sheets. Last but not least, something called assertions. Those are the validations Mark touched on briefly that we've been doing since 2010. These assertions come from the Data Quality Committee scans that are done on all of the data that comes into our database. We scan with Data Quality Committee checks. The Data Quality Committee is an effort undertaken by filing agents, some public companies that file with the SEC, some academics, and some investor relations professionals and investing professionals who are interested in using structured financial data to make decisions within their organizations. The right-hand side of this documentation screen shows you a little bit about the table of contents. Down below on the points that aren't shown is a little bit about obviously how to get started with the add-on that we're here talking about today, and also how to get started with a client ID and secret pair to take into something like an insomnia or another application that you may have that you're using to develop with. And that's really it, except to say that our members have broad access to all of the data that's available inside of the XBRL US database of public filings. We're, of course, interested in working with any corporate member that wants to make that API work with their own database. Mark mentioned that all it requires is that your data be aligned with the 2.1 specification. It may sound like a challenge, but if you think broadly about how your structured data exists inside of your own database, it may require a simple translation to get it into 2.1 spec and then apply the API over top of it and away you go. Sole practitioners and power users inside of XBRL US have similar access to the data for private non-commercial use. Sole practitioners, there's a little more latitude in terms of using the data with clients. And then finally, basic individuals, you're able to get a subset of the data available to you. Non-members, just very broadly put it out there. You can get 100 records at a time with a max of 1,000 records per query. So if there are more than 100 records that are returned, and in the template that Mark showed, there aren't more than 100 records, but in a situation where there are more than 100 records returned, you'll need to use something called an offset as one of the fields that you return in order to see the additional record sets. And again, that's discussed in the documentation. I have a couple of questions that have come in. Let's see, is it possible to have the API to add 2 or 3 concepts and return the total amount? Cash and short-term investments, cash equals cash equivalent. Some data is actually calculated inside of the document itself. For that, which isn't calculated inside of the document, you can actually just use the sum formula inside of a Google Sheet. And I hope I've answered that question. If not, and if you have other questions, I strongly encourage you to get connected with the data community, log in, post your question. It's likely that either myself or Mark or somebody from the community at large will have an answer for you. I don't know if there are any other questions. Mark, if you have any other comments?
Hey, David, I'll just go ahead, and there are a few questions that that had been asked that I was answering.
Okay.
And I'll just go through a couple of those. One was for the API, was the response in what format was the response? And the answer to that is JSON. So you can use any kind of JSON reader to organize that. Does XBRL US maintain a list of CIKs and the tickers? No, we don't, but you can go to the SEC website in order to get that. For the exact URL, I won't say it, but if you look at our API spreadsheet, you can find it in there. And David already answered that other one, so I think that's about it.
Okay, great. Mark, thanks so much. Thanks, Mark. And thanks everybody for showing up. Again, if you do have questions, reach out and post on the data community forum. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.